What's up, guys? Just finished up a workout incorporating a lot of resistance bands, and this jogged the memory of something I wanted to talk about potential ways resistance bands can actually cause training-related injuries and or hinder resistance training gains. That is primarily if you're using them as your sole form of resistance training versus generally what I recommend incorporating them with, at the very least, other bodyweight related exercises or traditional means like resistance training, free weights, dumbbells, barbells, stuff like that. I am going to recommend some other supplementary exercises. Everything in this video is not medical advice. Seek out your medical professional. Just my own personal opinions on some things I personally discovered, as well as talking with other people, clients, and also friends, whenever they start using resistance bands, thinking that they are a pretty much safe way of resistance training or safer just by default compared to traditional free weights or barbells. I don't think that's really the case. I think there's some nuance here, and I want to talk about some potential ways you could actually mess yourself up, or at the very least, like I said, hinder a lot of progress you could be getting if you were supplementing with other things. But certainly leave your guys' comments down below. This might trigger some people. It's not meant to. I love bands. I use bands. I sell band-related products like collar hooks. Got tons of band-related affiliates. I think they are the best, actually. Tons of stuff. I will link them down below in the description box if you guys are curious, including this little thing I don't feature enough that is actually very handy. This thing from Squat Harness, which is actually a magnetic holder for resistance bands. And I use this thing actually a lot. Kind of set an example of how this is the case where resistance bands can actually either cause injury or limit your gains. I'm going to give you guys a practical real life example that's happened to me many times, but I'll talk about specifically just using traditional free weights. Back when I was younger, my favorite thing, I think it was back in the day, this is because most people read magazines, and this was like the standard default, at least I found, bodybuilding shoulder exercise you'd always start with. Seated, heavy, dumbbell presses, and I got up to a pretty decent weight fairly quickly in my youth of like just repping out at this angle, 90 degrees, 100 plus, dumbbell repetitions. I thought I was pretty strong until I started kind of progressing to things like barbell, standing overhead presses, and I realized right away, like I just cannot. I was incredibly weak in this low start position with, say, a barbell press. Now, the first thought in my head was, this is not good for me. It kind of hurts my shoulders, it aggravates it, therefore maybe I should avoid it. When really that was not the case. Like many new exercises, if you try them or the first time trying them, or maybe laying off from a long hiatus, and this could be from doing resistance bands exclusively, or just a long break in your training, sometimes your body is just weak and has to work its way back up to it. So long story short, my shoulder worked perfectly fine in that lower range of motion. I was just incredibly weak because I was never training that range of motion. And this was the same case when I trained a lot of experimentation with resistance bands over the past year or so. This was nothing surprising to me, but whenever I would go back to, say, bench pressing or even deadlifts, even though I thought I was pretty strong with the relative weight and resistance bands with a band or bar type setup like X3, like you guys are seeing in this video. Actually, going back to this felt incredibly easy from going back to traditional deadlifts, kind of a side point. I felt very weak in that low start position. This was not surprising to me, but even when I went back to traditional bench pressing, which I didn't kind of do for a long period of time, I'm slowly getting back up to a very solid groove where I feel no pain whatsoever, back to how I used to feel. I could have thought in my brain, well, I'm just getting older and my joints are kind of getting more stiff. This is not good for me. I'm kind of pushing the limits. That really was not the case. I need to go back down, check my ego, lower the weights back down to a range of motion, a start range of motion that was fitting for me with that apparatus, just using a barbell and also the weight that I wasn't accustomed to using at heavy loads, say at that low start position. And so that leads me into resistance bands. So one of the benefits of resistance bands, everyone knows, is variable resistance. So on certain exercises, this isn't really as big a deal as some, so I'll get into that here in a second, but we all know in some of the case that people make for resistance bands being maybe superior to traditional free weights, or the fact that they're maybe less injury prone, is the fact that people will say, well, you're actually working through resistance bands at your most advantageous or strongest range of motion. So when I do a bench press or a chest press, this is the strongest position, therefore I can handle more weights. If I can theoretically handle more weights through the stronger range of motion, I'm lifting more weight relatively, and so over time there's better gains, quote unquote, but I'm not really getting a whole lot of range of motion, or I should say strength, sorry, in this bottom range of motion you traditionally would get. So most people will pick up resistance bands and say, well, this feels a lot better on my joints. I don't feel that joint stiffness, say, in my shoulder at that initial push-off. Again, could be a number of different things. If you have a legit injury, something like that, again, not medical advice, certainly this might be what you kind of have to do. My argument is that for some people, this could actually give a false sense of security where you could be doing too much too soon out of the gates. And I find this a lot with things like deadlifts and lower body exercises. I know a lot of people, and I've said this to many times with people, when they start doing resistance band training, they think, oh, it's just bands, I can't hurt myself. They've heard these kind of sales pitches with bands, and they start doing things like heavier deadlifts, and I'm telling them it still gives you compressive force, it's just more of a higher range of motion, and sure enough, many people do end up aggravating their back, injuring their back, and this happens not just with a deadlift, but even something like an overhead press, if it's heavy enough, can still put compressive force, on your spine if, say, you had some other previous injury, or you're just, again, doing too much too soon with this false sense of security with bands. So the exercises of concern that I think are really the limiting factor for this are primarily the lower body exercises, lunges, squats, deadlifts, and then the chest press kind of depends on what you're kind of using. You know, other things like bicep curls, you're already starting with some tension, so at that lower range of motion, you're already starting with some resistance. Same thing goes with like an overhead shoulder press, you still got some resistance out of the gate, but for the start of deadlifts, lower position of the squat, chest press, you don't have a whole lot. You're really working at this position or range of motion. By the way, a lot of the advocates that, a lot of the companies that I promote that use resistance bands, a lot of the guys who can sell those things are very big advocates of using both. So I just want to say that. But there are some people that I know that are promoters of resistance band training that they just use that. And they've given me anecdotal stories of how they've gone back to the gym for one reason or another, and they start using some free weights and like, oh, that old injury act up where it just hurts or aggravates their shoulders or hips. And I say to them again, like, is it really that previous injury, or is it kind of the chicken and the egg type thing where really you're not used to doing that range of motion, you get in something with free weights, you're used to this elastic kind of give or feel resistance of resistance bands, and that's what's really aggravating and doing something new you're not used to be doing. So that's what I was kind of throwing out there to be somewhat mindful of. Now, if that is you, for one reason or another, and you just say, I love resistance bands, though they're affordable, I don't want to deal with heavy weights, or you just maybe can't deal with them because of budgets or time, space constraints, whatever, I would consider a couple of things. Those exercises, and there's probably a few out there, but any of them that actually start with pretty much minimal resistance on that first range of motion, supplement with some other things at the very least, something like push-ups. I always recommend picking up probably some adjustable dumbbells, but I know people are just literally adamant, like they don't even want to touch anything else other than bands, but again, that's your discretion. But maybe to some basic push-ups, loaded squats from a bottom position, stay with a kettlebell, picking up something maybe heavy in your house, maybe using things like practicing that deadlift pattern, like a laundry basket, something relatively heavy to kind of work on those lower range of motions instead of excluding them altogether with resistance bands. Because I will say, if one's gonna influence the other, if I just trained exclusively with traditional, let's say deadlifts, for example, heavy deadlifts with a barbell, and I went to do a resistance band deadlift, definitely you're gonna be able to handle very heavy loads with that. It's gonna feel easier, but on the opposite, I do not think is true. In fact, I know it's not true. If you did a lot of heavy resistance band deadlifts, and then you go back to traditional deadlifts with barbells and free weights, you're gonna notice that that is not the same thing, and you are gonna feel weaker, especially on initial liftoff. Of course, people use bands throughout all the years, powerlifters use them, but they use them as a supplement to free weights. And if you're really kind of pushing back what I'm saying, I don't think it's really that controversial. Most of us would agree to the fact that previous example I set up with the shoulder press, lower range of motion, yeah, that makes sense. You'd be weaker in that lower range of motion if you're not training it. If you really want to get the same kind of pound for pound benefits of like, well, resistance is resistance, yes, that's true at a certain range of motion. But if I were to just go to the gym and I were to tell you guys, I just do like, you know, I start 90 degrees and I just do heavy bench presses here, heavy machine presses here, is that going to transfer over when I go a little bit lower and say doing a heavier chest press out of the gates? No, you're really just kind of training that little bit limited range of motion for resistance, and you're never giving your body or that range of motion a chance to adapt and grow on that lower range of motion to help build better integrity in muscles, tendons, ligaments, etc. That's it though, guys. Hopefully it wasn't too long-winded. I want to make this kind of, I think it's an important point to kind of consider on some weak points on resistance band training. At the very least, try supplementing with some of these other exercises. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys on the next video.